Good evening. I'm Susanna Greaves, and on behalf of White Cube, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Morgan Library this evening to hear Tom Eccles and Sir Antony Gormley in conversation. We're marking the opening this week of Antony Gormley's exhibition Aerial at White Cube, New York. The exhibition presents two distinct developments in his practice. One, an exercise in mass and scale in the form of 3 over-life-size cast-iron double blockworks that explore physical closeness in a radically reduced geometric language. The other, which gives its title to the show, is a near-massless branching matrix that measures and catalyzes the architecture of the gallery. If you haven't yet seen the exhibition, please do visit us at 1002 Madison Avenue, where Aerial remains on view until June 15th. We're delighted to be joined tonight by Tom Eccles, who is Executive Director of the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College and the founding director of the Hessel Museum of Art. Tom is currently the Visual Arts Curator at the Park Avenue Armory, where his program has included major exhibitions with Hito Steil, Paul McCarthy, Philippe Perreno, Ai Weiwei and Herzog and de Moron, Ernesto Neto, Nick Cave, and others. Since 2009, he's been a member of a core group of advisors to the Luma Foundation in Arles, and for 10 years he's also been the curator of the Talks program at Frieze, New York. From 1995 until 2005, he was the director of the Public Art Fund in New York City, where he organized over 100 ambitious exhibitions, working closely with artists including Vito Acconci, Rachel Whiteread, Barbara Kruger, Tony Orsler, Pierre Huyghe, and Louise Bourgeois. Antony Gormley is one of the most celebrated artists working today. He's widely acclaimed for his sculptures, installations, and public artworks that investigate the relationship of the human body to space. His work has been widely exhibited internationally, with recent exhibitions at the Musée Rodin in Paris, the National Gallery Singapore, the Royal Academy of Arts in London, the Uffizi Galleries in Florence, and Philadelphia Museum of Art. In 2012, the 31 body forms of his work Event Horizon appeared across Madison Square Park and the surrounding rooftops, and in 2020, another major public work, New York Clearing, was temporarily installed in Brooklyn Bridge Park. Gormley's permanent public artworks include one of the most recognizable landmarks in the UK, the Angel of the North in Gateshead, as well as Another Place at Crosby Beach and Inside Australia at Lake Ballard. He was made a Knight in the New Year's Honours List in 2014. Tom and Antony.
Great, thank you. Yeah, actually, Antony. Antony has a much, much longer resume than that. I'm very pleased, very honored to be asked to be in conversation with Antony tonight. We met some years ago when I was at the Public Art Fund, maybe 20, 25 years ago, developing a project that I think ultimately led in some ways to the works in Madison Square Park. And I was sort of thinking, okay, how to approach this talk, and I was sent a lot of diverse, fascinating materials, and so I thought, the biography of Antony is quite fascinating. I'm sure it's not known to all of you. To some of us it is, and then there are some really quirky parts of it that I think are interesting, but also offer some input into the various forms and the trajectory that Antony's work has taken over since really the mid-80s, and continues today with the show at White Cube. I know that some slides, 57 slides, have been organized here behind us in no particular order, but I think I'll give a reference point for tonight. Antony has been fascinated by the connection between beings. He's been exploring the individual and universal since the 1980s. He uses sculpture, the most materialist form, to address the spiritual and the imperceptible. And I think, so tonight, let's dig into what that is. Now, many of you don't know that Antony has initials AMDG, which are an inference to ad majorem Dei gloriam, to the greater glory of God. That's a burden. And he said once that I was educated by monks. I thank them dearly for my education, but I'm no longer a Catholic. He attended a significant Catholic college called Amplethorpe in Yorkshire as a young man, a Benedictine boarding school, and before he went to Trinity College, Cambridge, to read archaeology, anthropology, and the history of art. And so I think I'll start. Can you say something about this really quite significant intellectual formation?
That's a big question, isn't it? Like, it's a big like lump to have to deal with. I often have to say I didn't have a choice about being born with a penis. I didn't have a choice about being born into a Catholic family. But I think, yeah, once you have to deal with both things the best way you can. And it was a curious thing. I remember my dad taking me to this factory that he'd built in Havant, a small town on the south coast, to make simulated mother's milk, SMA. Yeah, stood me by this great big stone which had my initials on it. And there was a sense, I suppose, that he transmitted to me that somehow you have to make sense of your life, and that you should use it well. And I don't regret that, even though the idea that I am in some way a kind of a gift to some great deistic authority, I reject.
But it clearly seems that, in the early 70s you travelled between the university and art school. You travelled to India for I think 3 years. You explored Buddhism, but you also travelled. You were in India as a young man.
Yeah, no, I was a good hippie. I really, I guess, having studied anthropology, that was a wonderful thing to study before then studying the history of particularly Western art, because it gave me the tool to realise that this, as it were, history was one of many histories. This cosmology was one of many cosmologies. And certainly the minute I left university, I wanted to go and spend more time with those different cosmologies. And I used all of my long vacations to travel. So the first long vacation in 1969, I went to India, but traveling through Turkey, Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, and then in the next long vacation, I went to Egypt during the Egyptian-Israeli war, which was a fantastic thing to do because it was completely empty, and spent time in Syria and Lebanon, looking at places like Baalbek or Krakli, Chevalier. Anyway, I wanted to travel. I wanted to see and know other places, other ways of thinking. It took me a year to get to India. I spent 2 years in India, and yes, I got very involved in particularly Vipassana meditation, which then became an extremely important tool, and I guess discipline for the work itself.
I think it's upon returning from India, you made a piece called Sleeping Place, which I didn't know this work. It was a figure crouching on the ground, asleep, with a blanket or a sari or something over, made him so
it was an old hospital sheet that was dipped in plaster, and I laid it over the lying body of a friend. It was very much the memory of, I'm sure any of you who've travelled in India, it still exists, that people sleep on railway stations, on street pavements, everywhere, just wrapped in a dhoti, in a thin layer, often white, of white cloth. And that image of, in a sense, the abstraction of a particular life seen in public space, that expressed in the minimal architecture possible, a human space in space at large, remains, I think, a very key reference point in the later development of the work. And I made that in 1974 when I returned from India. There isn't a slide of it here, but there could well have been. And it became a point of reference. It doesn't exist anymore, but I think the way of its making, this indexical registration of a human space in space at large, was important.
I think it's also emblematic of the fact that I think empathy plays a large part in your work. Is that true?
Yeah. I grew up through college really deeply influenced by a whole generation of American sculptors. In particular, I would say Carl Andre, Walter de Maria, Richard Serra, and to a degree Naumann. I guess their principled analysis of how you could begin to think about sculpture again in material terms, remain for me an incredibly important example of how to proceed as an artist. You start with the material, you have a dialogue with it, you find ways of it, in a way showing its intrinsic qualities, but also in the way that you bring it together with maybe other elements similar to itself, a kind of part-whole relationship that sits in the world amongst other objects, but somehow is not utilitarian, is designed to engage the imagination of the viewer. But the thing that I recognized was that it's difficult to ascribe an emotion to, say, a metal floor piece of Carl Andre. And I like the idea of Andre's work as a place which invited, in a way, physical occupation by life, but then I wondered whether there was a way of making the statement of the body itself as a place, over and above its object nature, in other words, avoiding representation, think about the body as a place, and then allow that to receive the projected imaginative inhabitation. That requires empathy. That requires, in a way, the idea that, well, this thing may represent, as it were, the indexical capturing of a particular body in a particular position at a particular time, but could be anybody. Mm-hmm. And that was always the offer of the work, that here is, as it were, a subjective thing that comes out of a subjective experience that could pull through empathy the subjective response of a viewer.
I'd read also that going to an art school, you were working primarily with natural materials and wood, obviously. Was it looking at these artists that you then studied use more industrial materials, cast iron, lead?
Yeah, I started using lead simply because it was a metal that you could beat by hand and you didn't need to use a foundry. But then I liked its materiality, its attitude to light, the fact that it was so malleable and had this alchemical relationship with gold. But I guess the last two pieces that I would say were the precursor of me working directly with my body, a work called Room, where I took a set of my own clothes and simply expanded them to make an enclosure that you couldn't get into, but that you could look within. And then Bed, which was made out of 600 loaves of Mother's Pride, medium sliced, industrially produced bread, that I ate my own volume out of over 3-month period in 2 halves. Between what you wear and what you eat is where you are, and the next step seemed to me then obvious that I had to use, as it were, the only bit of the material world that I happened to inhabit, my own body, as primary material. So it was quite logical, in a way, my progression towards using, existence to examine existence.
And you said at the time how to make bodies into vessels that both contain and occupy space. The early 3-piece lead works are the first works in which I used my own body. I was trying to map out the phenomenology of the body and to find a new way of evoking it as being less a thing, more a place, a site of transformation, and an axis of physical and spatial experience. Throughout the late 80s, Antony's lead body cases were extended, suspended, sealed, pierced, and also doubled into 2-joined forms. I mean, you've really become, but can you say something about the importance of being your body?
I think it's the truth claim of the work, and I think it's the point at which I am contesting, as it were, a long history of statue making, often of the male artist making a surrogate body, usually based on seeing a naked model at a distance and remaking her in clay. And that just seemed that just seemed to me the whole artist model dialectic and the use of in a way an other body using, as it were, modeling and I guess the importance of apartness, that actually without distance you can't do that job. And I wanted to deny it and work from the other side of appearance, without distance, and in a way have a connection to a feeling. You might say, well, what are those feelings? Well, I think they were the feelings of the moment, which were essentially, can I remain alert and upright if it was a standing work? And be this place that I am now. And it's a very, very different, you could say, what has this got to do with visual art? Well, I think it connects to those very primary moments within our species where we have found it necessary to leave a registration of ourselves. And I'm thinking now of the hand stencils in particular that we find in Peshmerga, or, I was recently in the Maros caves in Sulawesi, and it's extraordinary to me that gesture of putting a hand against the wall of a cave and then spitting ochre or crushed carbon from carbon taken from charcoal in the fire, and leaving this trace against the skin of the earth. I think the gesture, the impulse to use, my body, which is, I didn't choose it. It was what I was given, but to register it in its particularity. Again, to come back to what we were talking about before, as an example of the universal human condition of incarnation, but at the same time doing something else, which is to say, yes, I am one of many. I am part of a species. I am part of a life form that has proliferated. And I guess for me, when I say truth claim, that sounds very grand, but I think that I didn't want this to be about expressionism. I didn't want it to be, in fact, about any form of image making per se, and certainly not about narratives. I wanted it to be about being, not doing. And this seemed to me the most direct way, very purposefully subjective, purposefully, you could say, particular, but with this power of saying this is an example of something that is shareable, that is actually common.
Mm. I mean, there's this interesting component, part two, that the works are quite abstracted. You're quite a formidable figure. So I remember kind of, always seeing a sculpture of yours that was near the Euston Station. One was always measuring oneself against your works, right? And
well, maybe that's a male issue. I don't know whether everybody would necessarily take this as the kind of opportunity.
But there's never been a drive. You've never thought, actually in this context. The other thing I want to say, that they always seem to perfectly articulate their space. So, and how is that so? I was thinking, is it just because they are figures in the landscape? Does a figure always, if it's here or it's here, is it still going to articulate the landscape? Is it still going to articulate the gallery space? They seem to always extend beyond themselves as objects.
Well, I think this is very kind of you. I think that, again, we have to appeal to what other people's experience is. I guess I'm of the same opinion as somebody like Judd, that actually the context is as important as the object or the instrument that you put into that context. And I pay a lot of attention to how something is placed and distributed, whether it's within a landscape or indeed within a room. And it's, you mentioned Event Horizon here in New York. I think that relationship between a work that is certainly neither in a gallery nor an institutional context, it's in the street. How that then relates to the life of that street, the energy of people going to work, coming back home after work, or going to the park. And I use this word acupuncture because I think it's a really useful one. I think one of the powers of sculpture is, in its stillness and silence, it can make, as it were, that flow of human life, the passerby, more evident, more conscious. And so, thinking about how I put the four body forms on the street for Event Horizon, I was thinking, how does that square, Madison Square, work? Where are the main confluences of activity? And can we play with them a bit? So I put one on that cross street entrance where you see down a long, narrow cross street, and then there was one high on a wall on the right-hand side. So the relationship between the ones that interrupt, as it were, the flow of life, the ones that you might catch, in the corner of your eye, and then you might realize there's another one. So the ones that you can see, and then the next phase of engagement with this, you could say, infection of city space is, well, where are the others that I can't see? And then you start looking and seeking and maybe seeking and not finding, but suddenly your attitude to where you are and how you are changes. I'm interested in all of that, and this is absolutely nothing to do, in a way, with the traditional ideas about showing art. It's thinking about art as having a totally different potential, which is that it is it's an acupuncture of place, but also of life as it's lived. It can be reinserted back into life so that existence of the collective body in a city suddenly becomes reflexive of its own condition. And that was what I know this man from. So we were going to make this work called the Manhattan Project, which was going to be 100 works that were going to be spread at 40 meters above mean sea level all over Manhattan, starting up by the Cloisters and going down to Fulton, you know, where the fish market was. And that was a really exciting, and that was a, you know, in the end, yes, you're right, that it became Event Horizon. But this, you know, we live in a time, yeah, I mean, I go on about this, but I mean, we live in a time of commodification and institutionalization. We live in a time of the culture industry. We live in a time in which culture, first-hand experience of objects that come from an internal necessity of an artist and just simply placed in a way that they can be shared with life at large. No ticket, no pre kind of programming intellectually or whatever. This has almost been forgotten, and I think it's really, really vital that we don't forget it, the potential of art to change life. And sorry, I've gone on a rant, haven't I? But
You've covered about 4 questions.
No, but it's really the power. You know, I go back to my childhood when my dad took me age 6 to the British Museum, and I saw, you know, the sacred bulls from the Palace of Sardon. And the way that sculpture can do that, stop you in your tracks and think about the world entirely freshly. What is this thing doing in my world, and what is it? And what is my world anyway? Is it mine? And where do I fit into it? I mean, the whole reflexive potential of art, not as a representation, but as question. I mean, I feel that so powerfully, that you know, my work is the materialization of a question. You could say, you know, the materialization of a question of somebody that, you know, wasn't sure whether I'd been born into the right family, you know, why I happened to, you know, have the name I had, or, and then I think I've translated that uncertainty into then making these objects that are themselves uncertain. They don't know what their status is. And I passionately believe that their status is only as, in a way, in their interaction with life itself. What is this thing? You know, what is it doing in the world with me? And the potential for that question then to kind of, yeah, turn itself back on the person that's asking it. And you know, that question, you know, what can sculpture do in our time? Why is it necessary? There are so many questions. I mean, so many allied questions to that. I think our species has always found it necessary to make models of itself in order to understand itself. The handprint is one example, but there are so many others. You know, think of the Venus de Lespuge, or the kind of, you know, there's the need to sort of somehow make something over there that comes from in here, that somehow like reorientates us. And I see myself as a kind of maybe you know, very late and uninformed you know, person trying to do exactly the same thing.
I mean, something that was quite striking to me, you know, this was 20 years ago, so I'm not sure if it's the same today, but your studio is quite small, or was quite small, and it was really...
Yeah, it was in the back garden. I mean, I started, the first studio that we built was made by Big Gabe, an amazing, like...
but it wasn't industrial, you know.
No, not industrial.
It wasn't industrial at all, and so it felt that the work did have a very intimate connection to you as a person, to you as a body, in a place that was quite intimate. I want to ask you about a much larger project, which is the Angel of the North. I'm sure everybody knows this gigantic angel-like figure that at Gateshead is sort of at the cusp of the north of England going towards Scotland, where Antony, in 1998, created really one of the most striking monuments in the United Kingdom, and is in fact, I think, the largest angel sculpture in the world.
Is it?
Not that I'm an expert. And but how did that's a sort of apex in a way. You know, you then go on to do a very large number of public projects. You've done a number before, but that must have been an incredible moment for you both as an artist and also as someone who's questioning, okay, what do I do next with my work, but also transformative in the sense that that involves various industrial processes that previously you'd never engaged in. Is that true?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just, right from the very beginning, I wanted to make art that was part of the world. And The Angel of the North was the second project. The first project was the Brickman for the Holbeck Triangle in Leeds. 1984, I was commissioned to make this, it was a 120-foot high tower in human form made out of bricks. For whatever reason, the council that gave me that commission then refused to give it planning permission. These things happen. And I think, yeah, I feel quite passionately that it's either art or it isn't art. There is no separate category of art that is called public art. It's either art or it's not art. Nobody asks for art to be privatized. Art is made to be shared. And that's always been an absolute passion of mine. The making of The Angel was an extraordinary experience because you could say this is, again, a very pre-modern idea. Can we make, for a community that has been told in a Milton Friedman late liberal economy has no future, can we make an object that becomes like a totem, but also a transitional object in this difficult time between the transitional time between the industrial and the information age, in a place of immense physical labour. The relationship between coal mining and shipbuilding in the northeast of England is well known. A 300-year history. So it was a real, I think, challenge to me as an anthropologist as much as an artist. Can we make a work that is as embedded in the seams of limestone and coal that underlie it as it is in the society that commissioned it? And it was an amazing privilege and an amazing story. And yes, it brought me close to industrial techniques that have now disappeared. So the Tyne and the Clyde were the two great shipbuilding rivers in Britain. Swan Hunters, which was the largest shipbuilding yard, had closed about 2 years before I got this commission. So we had to go around these engineering firms and find the guys who could bend ship plate and who understood the anatomy of a ship. And then, find, I mean, I was interested in that. How can we translate, if you like, the tectonics of a ship's hull to an image that treats the body as a place, that treats the body as a container. And that's how The Angel of the North came to be. And yes, you're right that it was made industrially, and perhaps you're right that was what began me looking from having made body cases for 15, 20 years into the idea of making body forms that were solid, massive displacements of space, and got me involved in foundries. But I've always wanted to use, I mean, even if you're right that the early works of mine were absolutely dependent on Vic and my wife and partner and fellow artist help making the molds of me, and the lead beating happened in sheds and temporarily rented spaces. And then there was a shift around the 90s when I started working with foundries, and The Angel of the North, you could say, came at a time when that shift in production, moving from hollow lead and plaster works to solid iron, also linked with this experience of mass engineering works in the northeast of England.
I mean, this was probably the most successful public art project of its generation. No, it also bringing together people of very working class background with people from very privileged backgrounds. It was a success, and I wonder, after this you must have been asked to do thousands of commissions. What is it? What is it when you're invited to do a commission or a public work, so to speak? When do you say, yes, that's something I'm interested in? What are the conditions of your interest?
Well, I think, yeah, the site is the most important thing, and it was this mound by the A1 is an ancient road that links the north and the south of our island, and there was a hill by the side of it that was made by out of the destroyed remains of the Lower Team colliery. All of the pithead baths, the winding stations, all of that had just turned into a rubble mound, and it looked to me like a tumulus, like an Iron Age or Bronze Age tumulus. And I thought, this is really important. This is the end of the industrial age for Britain, and it's this was a time when Margaret Thatcher was just closing all the coal mines and also all of the shipbuilding company. And I felt well, I've got to respond to this, because this is a moment in history that won't be repeated. And the mound was the thing that got my imagination going. And then I suppose the next really big project was exposure in Flevoland, and that was another extraordinary kind of site, because here, I can't remember what the figures are, something like 3,500 square kilometres of land recovered from the Inselmeer, from the inner sea of Holland, and the story of this recovery, the draining of an inland sea, that interested me, and so I made this work called Exposure, which is considerably bigger than the Angel, but hasn't quite got the same reputation.
Yeah, I mean, we probably don't have enough time to go into this, because I do think there is a sort of paradox in your work where you're sort of shifting between the figure and abstraction, and it comes out a bit in the current exhibition with.
Yeah, no, but I hope that it's very well illustrated in the slide deck here. That my subject is space, not the body. And I've explored it in two ways, and one is the body as a space, which relates absolutely to my experience of Vipassana, and wherever that space is that you go when you're awake, but you close your eyes, you are somewhere which has no objects, it has no edge, it has no limit. I think of the body primarily as this place, a place of consciousness. But then I'm also interested in the second body. If we live in a body, the body is contained by the built world, by architecture. And I have, right from the very beginning, and I think it is embedded in this sequence of images, explored, as it were, space as it comes in the units of the room, the building, the town, the village, the city. And the show here, I've tried to reassert the dialectic or the dialogue between these two attitudes to space, one from the side of the body and the other from the side of architecture. So I think of aerial as a proprioceptive environment. It's a place in which the space itself has been catalyzed, articulated through this structure, which has no direct reference to the body until you are in it, and it's your body that becomes then the subject of the space. There may be people who would say, well, this is the instrumentalizing of art, but it's not. It's actually a continuation of what Bruce Nauman did with his yellow corridors, what Serra increasingly successfully did with his talk to ellipses, making a space in which you become more and more conscious, you could say, of your precarity, but also of your journey through space and time. And that's exactly, for me, what aerial is. Aerial, without using, you could say, the fear factor that might be endemic to a work by Serra, I have tried to somehow make the air in the room more present, and your position within the room more present to you and to the room. You could say this is a kind of neurological system that allows the room to become conscious of its occupant and allowing you as the occupant to become more conscious of the room. And it has nothing to do with representation and everything to do with experience. But Serra would say the same. He would say, yeah, my sculpture, the subject of my sculpture is the experience of the viewer. And I absolutely agree with that.
I think for me, actually, it's funny because you once said the purpose of art is to ask the viewer, what shall I do with this thing? And I arrived at aerial, and I thought, what's this? You know, this isn't an Antony Gormley. And I was sort of looking for first I should say to everybody, it's well worth a trip uptown to the Upper East Side to see this quite major installation. It's quite dangerous. You literally sign a release form, and you'll find out why when you go in. You're very, very aware of your body. It's like walking into a Mondrian, New York City work, sort of dimensionalizing Mondrian and then referring back to the kind of orthogonal grid-like structure of New York City. So it feels very specific. Don't waste your time looking for figures because they're not there to find.
No,
you are the body. And at first I thought, well, maybe the height is Antony's height. It seems not to reference.
There's no reference in there at all. In fact, we had to be very the litigation atmosphere or context of New York means that we had to remove quite a lot of stuff within, as it were, the eye-line potential between, say, a 5-year-old and a mature person. So there is, no direct reference in any way to the specifics of either a particular.
I know we're going to go to questions in a moment, but we've got these double block works up here. There are 3 of these works upstairs, and I know your wife is here tonight too. These were conceived and I think made during the period of COVID and a period of isolation. And you've been a man who's traveled the world for 50 years, right? Which we started at. You know, what was the experience of COVID and how has it affected your work?
Yeah, I think this was just an acknowledgement of this time in which I think we were all invited to re-inhabit our own space in a way that perhaps the world hadn't allowed before. And it was interesting to me that living with another, just being with, breathing the same air, occupying the same space, maybe listening to the same bird song, there was a revelation in that to me about how our experience of selfhood could become amplified or extended simply through the proximity of another human being. And it has to be the significant other, the one that in a way you have known so well that in a way this is the medium through which you know yourself. And maybe that distinction between self and other becomes very blurred. And I think those works, sorry, we're now going backwards through other, in a way, meditations on, you could say, the mirror phase in Lacanian ideas, or mitosis as opposed to sexual reproduction, but it's a bit complicated to go into that now. But these works, particularly the two standing double works, are an attempt for me to make a work that acknowledge in a sense human vulnerability, our need for others to know ourselves, and the way in which, without making, it was very important to me, these were not dramatic works. They were made often by bringing two pre-existing works together, very much in response to my recent experience of getting much more familiar with the work of Rodin, because I did a show at the Rodin Museum, and then seeing how they could begin to share a common load path. In other words, you know, there's a center of gravity that is, as it were, well, they only are able to stand because of the existence of the parallel stack that they kind of share a center of gravity with. It was a wonderful, in a way, response to what I thought was the silver lining of COVID lockdown, which is that we maybe gave more attention to the familiar, to the neighborhood, you know, the place we lived, we dwelt in, our indwelling Umwelt, our indwelling surroundings, and that included, in a way, our lover, significant other, and then went on to be more than that, to be the recognition of a tree that we had never really maybe given any attention to, maybe a building that we had kind of driven or passed by but never looked at. And beyond that, I think all of those things, those beautiful things that happen when, you know, within buildings or within streets, people recognized each other, like saw neighborhoods that they had not seen before or not been part of. Sorry, this is all sounding a little sentimental, but I think that there was in the silver lining of COVID the possibility of another kind of living, where we weren't constantly chasing the opportunities to escape, but could dwell, could stay, could kind of be and be together.
That's a beautiful place to call an end. Thank you, Antony.